reforms in United Nations. Now, the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly is underway, and the 75th anniversary will be celebrated on 24th of October. Now, the need for reforms is an aspect which has been talked about for quite some time now in terms of multilateralism, the democratization of United Nations, as well as financial reform. So we'll try and understand as to what exactly can be done for reforms at United Nations and how it can be done. For more on this, we are joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you. We have with us former Ambassador Dilip Sinha, who is also the former permanent representative of India to United Nations. We also have with us Pramit Paul Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor with Hindustan Times. And we're also joined by Professor Harsh V. Pant, Head of ORF's Strategic Studies. Welcome, all of you, gentlemen, to Rajya Sabha Television. Let me begin with you, Ambassador Sinha, since you've been there as India's permanent representative. If you could give us a backgrounder of sorts in terms of what exactly has United Nations achieved in the past 75 years and why this constant talk of reforms at UN?
Well, the UN's achievements have been in various fields. You start off with the Security Council, where the achievements have been rather limited, but they have been there. The most important of them being the peacekeeping operations that they have. Then they have taken some military actions on occasions. It's a mixed bag, but that's a long history. Then you have the larger picture of what the General Assembly has achieved in terms of decolonization, anti-racism against apartheid, and then the efforts to bring about a new international economic order where its success was rather limited. And then, of course, there are the various other bodies, the UNESCO, etc., the other and the specialized agencies like WHO, the WIPO, etc., all of which have played a major role in promoting globalization and creating an international order in which globalization could flourish. So it's a very vast span that you're talking about. When we talk about reforms, most countries focus on specific areas. And when we talk about reforms, we are essentially talking about reform of the Security Council and the relations of the Security Council with the General Assembly. So these are the two areas where the open-ended working group that is currently there in New York is focusing on. Okay.
And the underlying theme, it looks like, is multilateralism, because we are no longer a bipolar situation. We have there are several countries which would, or rather have been asking for their fair share at United Nations.
Well, yes, multilateralism itself is being questioned today because the earlier power structure, as you know, the permanent five that were given the special status in the Security Council and in the UN system itself. That is a structure that was there 75 years ago. Today, the world has changed. There are many new powers. There's Japan, there's Germany, which are major economic powers. India has emerged as both an economic power and a major political power in the world. There's Brazil, there's South Africa. So these countries that have emerged in the global scene now want to play a prominent role and enjoy equal status with the permanent five. And that is one aspect of relations. The other is that there are human rights itself has become extremely important. Democracy has become extremely important in international relations today. So the idea that only governments should deal with international relations and other major powers like the transnational corporations, NGOs, and human beings themselves, and the idea of human rights, the idea of national sovereignty, all these are being questioned in the international system today.
Okay. Professor Pant, quite a lot on the table out there. So the one right question can be where to begin.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, this has always happened with the UN. Whenever you start talking about United Nations, you always end up in, because as Ambassador Sinha explained, the range is quite vast. There is no aspect of international relations that is in some way or another not affected by UN's ability to shape the larger environment around which these issues have been discussed. So I think we are we have become so used to United Nations being with us since 1945 that it's very difficult to visualize a world order without it. As someone has said, if UN were not there, you would have to invent the UN or UN-like organization. I think the problem today is I think a bit more acute in terms of the future of global multilateralism. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the essential question that perhaps needs to be asked, that given the challenges that the world order is facing, both from the existing power structure as well as the emerging power structure. So, UN reflecting a certain power structure that existed at the time of 1945, that is coming under strain. And you have both these power centers, those established powers that are looking at multilateralism in a very different light. Mm-hmm. When Mr. Trump says America first, he's responding to a certain instinct in the Western world today that is more inward-looking than in the past. And this has grave implications for the larger multilateral order, including the UN. And when China refuses to abide by the multilateral order that exists today, it poses another set of challenges. So I think that the multilateral order, which is anchored around the UN, is facing a challenge today, unlike that we have seen in recent years. And that is why the debate at when UN is celebrating its 75 years of existence becomes that much more acute, coming on top of larger structural changes that are already happening in the world and are shaping this larger requirement. So therefore, the question essentially is about what is the future of multilateralism and what role the existing structures of United Nations can play in that space. Because as Indian Foreign Minister himself has said, that multilateralism actually is at a crossroads. It has failed. It seemingly failed at a time when during the COVID-19 crisis, for example, when it was most required. So clearly, I think policymakers are looking at a world, at the multilateral, order from a very, very different set of lenses, perhaps, that they used to in the past. And that, therefore, brings pressures on the UN and on this whole debate on reforms.
Okay. So basically looking for a way to create harmony between the existing structures and the emerging structures as well. Pramit, from your point of view, where should the focus be actually? Multilateralism or looking at it from the existing structures or existing powers point of view, or the emerging powers point of view?
Well, the primary concern I think that the United Nations has is at present is its relevance. And I think on a number of points, it needs to rework itself. The obvious one, which the others have discussed, and we in India, of course, are very focused on, is the question of expanding the UN Security Council and making it more representative of the present global power structure. That's a process, but it's going to be a very long process, and my sense is that it's going to be even more difficult in the next several years than it was in the past. Second, but I think the other issue in the second part of it is that there are a lot of new global challenges. And the UN perhaps needs to find new structures to handle them. An obvious one is now pandemics. The WHO has shown itself to be, it is a solid organization, but in this case, it failed miserably to get its act together. And it showed its internal structure, where it is dominated by a combination of NGOs and a sort of a incoherent set of regional groups without a very strong central command, proved to be incapable of handling the present crisis. Something needs to be done on that front. Climate is an enormously important challenge, arguably the most important long-term challenge the world faces today. And while the UN obviously has been at the head of it through the climate conference and things like the Paris Accord, it needs something much more than just having a council, conferences and the secretariat attached to it. Something more needs to be done both at the international and even at the regional level on climate. I would also throw in digital standards, digital economic issues. Those are the future trade issues that the world is going to be fighting over or coming together on, depending on how you look at it. The World Trade Organization is very poorly equipped to look at those type of issues. In fact, doesn't really look at them at all. And there is no real UN organization that is doing that, which is one of the reasons you're seeing that the world's splitting up into different, whether it's 5G telecom standards or data privacy laws, rules and standards. And these are things that the UN should at least be starting to work itself into developing some sort of a consensus, even on at least beginning a debate, if you wish, on these issues on the international front. And finally, I think the UN needs to have a couple of big successes in the next decade or so to revive global or public belief that this is an organization that matters. Its big accomplishments are largely in the past. Its present record is its associations are with failure or relevance, and as a consequence, you have the United States, the world's most powerful nation, openly basically losing interest in the United Nations as an organization, and you also have China, the second power, seeing the UN as an organization that is something that it should actually be trying to capture. And use for its own very narrow-minded domestic purposes. So China, if I'm correct now, China heads 4 UN agencies, which is a record for any major country in the world, or any country in the world. And what has it done with that, with its chairmanships? It's basically then said, for example, at the International Telecommunications Union, it's spent its time trying to make sure that everybody in the ITU uses Huawei 5G technology and buying Chinese equipment. So these are the things that the UN really needs to be looking at.
Okay, indeed, those are some very hotly debated topics, and United Nations does need to go ahead and put them in the mainstream debate out there. And Mr. Sinha, 2 aspects here. One, as Pramit pointed out, the relevance itself of United Nations as an international body is something which is obviously a cause of concern. Also, the very fact that, earlier discussions or talks or attempts at having reforms in United Nations does not seem to have had, much tangible action or much tangible results coming out. So from here onwards, after completing 75 years, what exactly can be done to, learn from their previous experience and move ahead and ensure that we can this time make a difference?
Well, when we talk about UN reform, we have to keep in mind that, as Pramit pointed out, there are various aspects of multilateralism in the world today. And in most of these issues like trade, like the digital world, the UN does not play much of a role. In fact, the UN doesn't play any role at all. These are largely in the hands of private bodies, other international organizations, and in the hands of regional organizations. The UN has been successful in the environmental field, in climate change, and then it is essentially then goes back to its primary role, which the Security Council was set up for, was maintaining international peace and security. And that by far is the most difficult role today in globalization. Along with that, you have the issues of democracy, of liberal democracy, of human rights, which are extremely important to the Western countries. And when they talk about UN reform, they talk about strengthening the UN's capacity to intervene in bringing about democracy and protecting human rights in countries. There is, of course, the alternative model that China offers of its own single-party state, its own autocratic model, where it thinks that is the model that the world should move towards, which would really mean an international organization that is confined to only certain aspects of intergovernment relations. It will not intervene at all in anything that comes in the sphere of national sovereignty. And of course, the permanent 5 remain in full control of the organization, because China is totally opposed to any kind of expansion of the Security Council. Now, expansion of the Security Council or any other aspect of reform of the UN is extremely difficult today, given the fact that there is no international consensus. Even among the P5, there is no consensus. And if you have a global meeting of 193 countries. You can keep meeting for months on end and nothing will come out of it. So perhaps we have to focus specifically on certain areas of reform, like the specific question of expansion of the Security Council, the issue of the veto, the issue of the permanent membership itself. And there, I think we have to start thinking about whether we can move forward in Security Council reform the way India wants it, in terms of expansion of the permanent members and non-permanent members, or perhaps we should address the question of the veto itself, which is also a very important aspect on which there can perhaps be wider agreement than on the question of expansion.
Okay, clearly there has to be specific, aspects which need to be looked into. Professor Pant, when we are talking about specific aspects, one more in terms of reforms is the financial aspect, the financial reforms, and perhaps it holds the key to the future of United Nations as well. Without sufficient resources or financial resources, to be precise, its activities, its role might diminish. So that also is a very, very important area.
Well, as I see, they are interlinked. You cannot really be talking about reforms without talking of financial accountability, and vice versa, because clearly, the countries, especially the US, which have been the biggest financier of the UN, has often used that leverage to make its displeasure clear at various points. And now, when you see this almost contestation happening between US and China, this becomes a major point of contention. And there are many countries that feel that they have contributed so much financially. For example, Japan was a major contributor, and yet there is a great amount of disenchantment that what does Japan gain out of that contribution? So really what we are looking at is how do you make sure that the financial structures, the financial accountability part of it, enmeshes very better than in the past with the larger functioning of the UN. And there we have seen some administrative reforms, for example, but we have not seen the kind of reforms, the kind of structural reforms that are perhaps needed to make UN an organization that can actually, move out of this persistent problem of finances being controlled by someone, and that particular country deciding to tighten the screws at critical points. So now what also seems to be happening is that in this contestation between two major powers, China, for example, seems to be more and more interested in gaming the system. So as Pramit was pointing out, it now is heading so many major institutions within the UN. It takes an active interest on who actually gets appointed. So, for example, the whole crisis on WHO is a result of Chinese-supported individuals being there and therefore not performing to the and performing more in sync with Chinese priorities than in sync with the global priorities. And so that aspect where the other countries seemingly like America withdrawing from the system, not taking an active interest, and that creates this complicated picture of where do those countries go that actually have a stake in the UN but actually are feeling left out because of this struggle. So clearly, when you address the question of finances, when you address the question of who is contributing how much, and how is that being utilized, because a lot of the times initial questions came up a lot about corruption, a lot about mismanagement of finances, and those the UN system has tried to rectify by initiating a set of administrative reforms, as the former Secretary General used to call them. But those administrative reforms have not been enough to fundamentally alter the structural imperatives of the UN. And that creates this tension as to you have to keep on relying on certain actors for finances, and those certain actors will obviously use that as a leverage. And now we are also witnessing something very interesting, which is that the top leadership of UN and UN bodies have been openly supporting Chinese projects. So, for example, the kind of enthusiasm that UN has shown for BRI is quite extraordinary. Going around the world and making a case for BRI on behalf of the Chinese. So clearly, what we are witnessing is that the great power contestation is now very much part of the UN functioning, and the question of resources, question of financing, is inextricably linked with how far reforms can perhaps go within the present-day system.
Okay, and what's the best way then to navigate this particular situation? Because as Ambassador Sinha pointed out, specifics will have to be looked at.
Yes, I think specifics will have to be looked at, and it will have to be about, I think, domain reforms rather than and wholesale reforms that perhaps we are so prone to becoming talking about. So perhaps if you look at domains, and if we start seeing that, for example, security and peace and security reforms, which will entail a different set of reforms, then say reforms of who gets elected, how individuals get elected to major bodies, how nations represent themselves in various institutions. I think that requires a set of conversations which perhaps the conversations that we have been having for the last few decades have already become redundant. So if you look at the older set of reforms that were proposed during the last decade, and some of them actually got implemented, which were called as the administrative reforms, those administrative reforms no longer seem important or even enough in terms of what the challenges we are facing today. Okay. So at this point, when you are looking at the 75th anniversary of the UN, or even in the last 5 to 6 years, the kind of challenges that have emerged are quite distinct from the kind of challenges we were talking about, say, during the last 15 to 20 years. So in that sense, the pace of change in the larger international environment has been quite rapid. The rise of China has been quite rapid, and therefore the conversations have not really, the discussions around UN reforms have not really kept pace with those changes. Okay. So my sense is that unless we start talking about specific and domain-specific reforms, the large-scale reforms, I'm not so sure that it's very worthwhile talking about them, because clearly there are structural impediments to those large-scale reforms as we talk, as we have been discussing for the last several decades.
Okay. Pramit, your views on that domain-specific reforms, given the fact that there are new challenges, new issues which need to be looked at, and it's a very complex situation, complex web here.
Well, the UN is ultimately an organization of sovereign governments. So the real issue is, when do these governments themselves begin to think that they need to do something about this? The obvious first big change or hoped for change would be Washington, to see whether or not a second Trump administration or Biden administration will take both multilateralism and the United Nations more seriously. Biden obviously would, is a Democrat, he's a liberal internationalist, and there I would see climate as being the primary area. America would rejoin the international system at a much more vigorous level to sort of compensate for 4 years of basically doing nothing. And there, I think they would be joined. There would really not be any contest from any other country, even China, because it is simply so clearly a globally important issue. Pandemics or global health, obviously, is another area, a little more tricky, but definitely something now people obviously take much more seriously. And some sort of a structure that is much more coherent, more centralized, and more, in fact, invasive, if you wish, in terms of the UN being able to monitor or collect information from other countries is going to be necessary. And those two alone, I think, would be an enormous shift, a forward movement in making the UN much more relevant to what we're seeing today. The other domain area that I mentioned is digital. That's going to be much more difficult because that is definitely very geopolitical. But I said again, the debate, the arguments, the discussion on these issues needs to begin, and the UN is obviously the best neutral environment to begin that process. Even if the UN is able to ensure that, for example, the global digital economy is not fragmented into more than 2 or 3 segments, that would be an accomplishment. And if they can get those digital segments, whether the Chinese-based internet digital standard structure versus one that is American-centered and so on, are at least able to integrate to some degree, and as a consequence of UN action, that would still be an accomplishment. Those are the kind of domain things that the UN needs to be looking at.
Okay. Ambassador Sinha, concluding comments from you before we bring this discussion to an end?
Well, you see, the multilateral system and the UN system so far have been controlled by the US and its allies, Western countries. And we have been pointing out the flaws, like funding that you mentioned, the control of big money, the control of extra budgetary resources that go into controlling these organizations. Now what's happened is that China has emerged, and China has learned to game the system. And the Chinese control over it is through not only constitutional means, but also through means like bribing, which has happened in the past. So we have a new kind of a problem. The earlier problem was there, but now that you have China gaming the system, it has created a new situation for all of us, and we have to address that problem.
Okay, there it is. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, Pramit, as well as Professor Harsh Pant, for sharing your views.